January 15th, 1945. 8:47 a.m., somewhere in the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest, Belgium. Obergruppenleiter Klaus Hartmann crouched behind the concrete pillbox, watching the American column approach through the morning mist. The 26-year-old veteran of 3 years on the Eastern Front allowed himself a cold smile as he studied the Sherman tanks grinding toward his position through the snow. The German defensive line, a maze of reinforced bunkers, machine gun nests and tank traps carved into the forest, had already stopped 2 American attacks in the previous 48 hours. Hartmann had personally witnessed a dozen Shermans burning like torches after encountering the interlocking fields of fire his regiment had established. But something about this column was different. Among the standard M4 Shermans, several tanks displayed unusual modifications. Extended tubes protruded from their hulls, and their turrets had been replaced with peculiar armoured structures. Hartmann called to his commander, Feldwebel Otto Becker, pointing at the strange vehicles. Becker raised his binoculars, studied the approaching armour for a long moment, then lowered them with a dismissive grunt. "Flammenwerfer tanks," he announced to the bunker crew. "The Americans think fire will scare us. They must have forgotten we invented this weapon." The men in the pillbox laughed nervously. They had all heard stories about Soviet flamethrower tanks on the Eastern Front. Crude machines that rarely survived long enough to deploy their weapons. The idea that the Americans would waste resources on such vulnerable weapons seemed almost insulting. One of the younger soldiers, barely 18 years old, asked if they should be worried. Becker spat on the concrete floor. "Those things have to get within 50 meters to be effective. We'll kill them at 500 meters with the Pak-40. They're coffins on tracks, nothing more." The men settled back into firing positions, confident in their assessment. Above them, the forest itself had been transformed into a fortress. Every tree concealed a weapon. Every shadow hid a foxhole. The German 12th Volksgrenadier Division had spent 3 weeks fortifying this section of the Ardennes, creating a defensive complex that American commanders had already nicknamed the Green Hell. What none of the German defenders knew, what they couldn't have imagined as they watched those strange tanks approach through the snow, was that they were about to experience a weapon that would redefine the meaning of terror in modern warfare. Within 30 minutes, Klaus Hartmann's concrete bunker would be transformed into a crematorium. Within an hour, his entire company would cease to exist as an effective fighting force. The American tank he was watching, officially designated the M4A3R3, but universally known as the Zippo, carried 290 gallons of napalm-thickened fuel and a pressure system capable of projecting burning gel 150 yards with such force that it could flow through firing slits, around corners, and into the deepest recesses of fortified positions. The flame it produced burned at 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, consume oxygen, and reduce human beings to ash in seconds. The Germans called flamethrowers mercy weapons because they killed quickly. They were about to learn that mercy had nothing to do with it. The M4A3R3 flame tank emerged from one of the most brutal lessons of amphibious warfare in human history. The weapon's origin story began 7,000 miles away from the Ardennes forest, on a series of tiny coral islands scattered across the central Pacific, where American Marines were discovering that conventional weapons were almost useless against Japanese defensive fortifications. On November 20th, 1943, the 2nd Marine Division landed on Tarawa Atoll, a fortified coral island barely 3 miles long. The Japanese had constructed over 500 reinforced concrete pillboxes, many with walls 4 feet thick and roofs covered with steel rails and coral. The Marines brought flamethrowers, portable M1A1 models that could shoot flame about 40 yards for roughly 10 seconds before exhausting their fuel supply. The Marine Corps after-action report from Tarawa was brutally honest. Portable flamethrowers proved marginally effective against reinforced positions. Operators were exposed to enemy fire while approaching targets. Weapon range insufficient to engage pillboxes from covered positions. Fuel capacity inadequate for sustained operations. Of 200 flamethrower operators who went ashore at Tarawa, 178 became casualties before they could employ their weapons effectively. The survivors reported that even when they successfully attacked pillboxes, the limited fuel supply meant they could only engage 1 or 2 positions before becoming helpless. Lieutenant Colonel William J. Whaling, who had observed flamethrower operations at Tarawa, submitted a recommendation that would change the nature of Pacific warfare. "We need flamethrowers mounted on tanks," he wrote in his report. "The armour provides protection for the operator, the vehicle provides mobility, and increased fuel capacity would allow sustained operations against multiple targets. We're trying to burn out fortifications with cigarette lighters when we need blast furnaces. The Chemical Warfare Service, responsible for flame weapon development, had already been experimenting with mechanized flamethrowers. Early attempts mounted portable flamethrower units on the sides of Stuart light tanks, but these improvised weapons retained all the limitations of portable systems while adding mechanical complexity. What the Marines needed was something far more powerful. The solution came from an unlikely source: civilian industry. In January 1944, the Navy's Bureau of Ships contracted with several industrial companies to develop a high-capacity mechanized flamethrower that could be mounted on standard tanks. The specifications were demanding: range of at least 100 yards, fuel capacity sufficient for 60, seconds of continuous flame, pressure system capable of projecting thickened fuel, an installation that wouldn't compromise the tank's mobility or armor protection. The engineering challenge was immense. Conventional flamethrowers used compressed air or nitrogen to propel fuel through a nozzle where it was ignited. But achieving the range and duration the Marines needed required pressure levels that would rupture standard fuel tanks and destroy conventional nozzles. The breakthrough came when engineers realized they needed to rethink the entire system. Instead of trying to build a bigger portable flamethrower, they would design an industrial flame projector that happened to be mobile. The E45 flame unit, prototype of what would become the M4A3R3, was essentially a miniature oil refinery fitted into a tank hull. 2 cylindrical fuel tanks, each holding 145 gallons of napalm gel, were installed in the sponsons where the Sherman's ammunition racks normally resided. A 200-gallon water tank was mounted in the turret basket. A gas-driven pump pressurized the water to 350 pounds per square inch. This pressurized water forced the napalm through armored fuel lines to a flame gun mounted in the bow, where a series of electric igniters provided continuous ignition. The system was brilliant in its brutality. The napalm itself was a recent development, gasoline thickened with aluminum salts to create a gel that stuck to surfaces and burned with incredible intensity. When projected at high pressure through the flame gun, the napalm formed a coherent stream that could punch through smoke, rain, and wind. The gel clung to whatever it hit, continuing to burn even on vertical surfaces or underwater. The burning time was approximately 60 seconds with both tanks full, but doctrine called for short bursts of 3 to 5 seconds. This meant a single Zippo could engage 12 to 20 separate targets before exhausting its fuel supply. The first combat test of the flame tank concept came on February 19, 1944, at Eniwetok Atoll. 8 M4A3R3 Stuart light tanks had been fitted with E45 flame units in a rushed field modification. The results exceeded all expectations. Lieutenant Colonel Harold C. Roberts, commanding the tank unit, reported that a single flame tank neutralized 18 Japanese pillboxes in 45 minutes, a task that would have required a full infantry company supported by demolitions and taken hours with conventional weapons. Marine infantry following the flame tanks discovered something unexpected. Japanese defenders weren't just killed by the flame tanks, they were psychologically destroyed. Pillboxes that had fought to the last man in previous battles were found abandoned after flame attacks, the defenders having fled into the jungle rather than face the flame weapons. Some bunkers contained Japanese soldiers who had shot themselves rather than burn. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical destruction. The Chemical Warfare Service immediately prioritized flame tank production. The M4A3 Sherman was selected as the base vehicle, chosen for its more powerful 500 horsepower Ford GAA engine, improved armor protection, and standardized production. The flame unit was designated E45R3, later simplified to R3 in official nomenclature. The complete weapon system became the M4A3R3, though crews universally called it the Zippo after the popular cigarette lighter. The first production Zippos arrived in the Pacific in August 1944. The 713th Tank Battalion, Provisional, received 8 flame tanks for the assault on Peleliu. The Marine Corps historians' report on their employment was stark. Flame tanks proved decisive in reducing fortified cave positions. On September 18, 1944, a single flame tank neutralized 11 cave complexes that had resisted 3 days of infantry assault. Enemy resistance in treated areas dropped to 0 within minutes of flame attack, No instance recorded of enemy forces continuing to defend positions after successful flame engagement. But it was the performance of flame tanks during the Battle of Iwo Jima that would cement their reputation as the ultimate fortification killer. Iwo Jima was a volcanic rock 8 square miles in area, featuring 11 miles of underground tunnels connecting over 1,500 defensive positions. The Japanese 109th Division had spent 8 months transforming the island into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Every cave had been reinforced with concrete, every pillbox camouflaged, every position designed for interlocking fire. The American plan called for overwhelming firepower. The Navy subjected Iwo Jima to the longest and heaviest bombardment of the Pacific War, 3 days of continuous shelling that fired more ordnance than had been used in some entire campaigns. When the Marines landed on February 19, 1945, they expected to find the defences shattered. Instead, they discovered that the Japanese had survived the bombardment by retreating deep into the tunnel system. Within minutes of the landing, Marines were taking devastating casualties from positions that appeared undamaged. The 3rd Marine Division's after-action report noted that conventional weapons were almost useless against Iwo Jima's defences. Artillery shells bounced off reinforced concrete. Bazookas couldn't penetrate the thick walls. Infantry armed with satchel charges and flamethrowers were cut down before reaching their targets. The battle was degenerating into a meat grinder. Then the Zippos arrived. The 5th Tank Battalion included 8 M4A3R3 flame tanks. Their first combat action on February 23, 1945, targeting a complex of pillboxes near the base of Mount Suribachi, demonstrated what American industry had created. Sergeant Robert Swope, commanding a Zippo nicknamed Blaze of Glory, later described the engagement in a letter to his family. "We approached the first pillbox from about 80 yards. I could see the Jap machine gun firing at our infantry, who were pinned, down in shell holes. I gave the order to flame. The gunner pressed the trigger and a river of fire shot out of the bowgun port. It looked like a solid stream of orange light, so bright you couldn't look directly at it. The stream hit the pillbox entrance and just poured inside. Within seconds, thick black smoke was pouring out of every opening. We hit it with 2 more bursts, maybe 4 seconds each. Then we moved to the next position. Behind us, nothing moved in that pillbox. Nothing could move. We had just poured 20 gallons of burning gel into a confined space. The temperature inside must have been like a blast furnace. The psychological effect on Japanese defenders was immediate and total. Marines following the flame tanks reported finding positions abandoned, weapons still in place, ammunition intact. Defenders had simply fled rather than face the flame weapons. Some caves contained evidence of mass suicides, Japanese soldiers having used grenades on themselves rather than burn. But what truly distinguished the Zippo from earlier flamethrowers was its range and persistence. The pressurized napalm could reach positions that portable flamethrowers couldn't touch. The gel's adhesive properties meant it flowed into every crevice of a fortification, burning for several minutes and consuming all available oxygen. Cave systems with multiple chambers and exits were particularly vulnerable. A flame burst into the main entrance would flow through the tunnels, following air currents, seeking oxygen. Japanese defenders retreating deeper into caves to escape the flame often suffocated as the fire consumed the air. Bodies were found hundreds of feet from cave entrances, killed by carbon monoxide poisoning or heat exhaustion, rather than direct flame contact. By the end of the Iwo Jima campaign, the 8 Zippos of the 5th Tank Battalion had destroyed or neutralised over 200 fortified positions. Marine Corps analysts calculated that each flame tank had accomplished the work of an entire infantry company, saving countless American lives while accelerating the battle's conclusion. But the Pacific War would end before the Zippo could be deployed in the numbers military planners envisioned. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 rendered the planned invasion of Japan unnecessary, and with it, the massive flame tank force being assembled for Operation Downfall. The M4A3R3 might have become a footnote in military history, a specialised weapon designed for a specific theatre, if not for the brutal winter offensive that trapped American forces in Belgium's Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's last major offensive in the West, created defensive situations remarkably similar to those encountered in the Pacific. German forces had fortified the Ardennes with interlocking bunkers, pillboxes, and field fortifications that proved extremely resistant to conventional assault. The 2nd Armoured Division, transferred from occupation, duties in France to counter the German offensive included the 739th Tank Battalion. Among its assets were 6 M4A3R3 flame tanks, originally destined for Pacific service, but diverted to Europe when shipping priorities changed. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Brown, had read the after-action reports from Iwo Jima. He understood what his flame tanks could do. The German defenders in the Ardennes had no such knowledge. This is where Klaus Hartmann's story resumed on that frozen January morning. As the American column approached his position, Hartmann watched the strange Sherman tanks with mild curiosity but no real fear. He had seen flamethrowers before, crude Soviet OT-34 tanks that rarely survived their first encounter with German anti-tank weapons. The improvised German flamethrower vehicles were equally vulnerable, thin-skinned and short-ranged. The Americans, Hartmann assumed, had simply copied these inadequate designs. The American tank stopped at approximately 200 yards, hull down behind a slight rise in the terrain. This was curious. Flamethrowers needed to close to point-blank range to be effective. What were they doing so far away? The answer came with shocking suddenness. The lead Zippo elevated its flame gun slightly, and a tongue of orange fire erupted from the bow. But this was nothing like the flamethrowers Hartmann had encountered in Russia. The flame was a solid stream, coherent and focused, arcing through the air like a fiery lance. It covered the 200-yard distance in less than a second and struck the concrete pillbox directly to Hartmann's left. The napalm splashed against the bunker's firing slit and poured inside. The men in that position, Hartmann's friends, his comrades, began screaming immediately. The sound was inhuman, beyond description, the kind of sound that would echo in nightmares for decades. Within seconds, thick black smoke was pouring from every opening in the bunker. The screaming continued for perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then silence. Hartmann stared in horror. The flame tank was still 200 yards away, well beyond the range of any flamethrower he had ever heard of, and it was moving to the next target. The second burst hit another pillbox. More screaming, more smoke. The German defensive line, so carefully constructed, was being systematically dismantled by a weapon that shouldn't exist. Feldwebel Becker, the confident veteran who had dismissed the flame tanks minutes earlier, was shouting into a field telephone trying to get artillery support. But the American armour was advancing behind a screen of smoke, and German observers couldn't identify targets. The Pek 40 anti-tank gun, positioned to engage at medium range, fired at the lead Zippo. Hartmann saw the tracer streak toward the Sherman and strike its frontal armour. The shell deflected upward at a sharp angle, its penetration defeated by the tank's sloped glacis plate. The Zippo didn't even slow down. It rotated its hull slightly, elevated the flame gun and fired. The stream of burning gel arced through the air with impossible range and struck the Pak 40 position directly. The crew, exposed in their gun pit, were engulfed in liquid fire. They abandoned the weapon after the first burst, running blindly through the snow with their uniforms ablaze. 3 of them made it perhaps 20 yards before collapsing. The 4th stumbled into a shell crater and disappeared beneath the snow, the steam of extinguished flames marking his position. Hartmann realized with absolute clarity that his bunker was next. He turned to run, but Becker grabbed him, shouting that desertion meant a firing squad. Better a firing squad than burning alive, Hartmann thought. But he stayed. The discipline of 3 years as a soldier held. The Zippo approached methodically, engaging each position in sequence. The American tactics were brutally efficient. The flame tank would hit a bunker with a 3 to 5 second burst, enough to kill everyone inside and start secondary fires. While that position was burning, the Zippo would move to the next target. Standard Shermans followed behind the flame tanks, their 75mm guns ready to engage any position that showed resistance. American infantry advanced in the wake of the armour, mopping up survivors. There weren't many survivors. When the Zippo turned toward Hartmann's position, he discovered something worse than fear. He discovered absolute helpless terror. The flame gun elevated. The gunner was taking his time, adjusting for wind and range. Hartmann could see the American tank commander standing in his hatch, observing calmly, as if this were a training exercise. Then the flame erupted. The stream of fire arced through the air, bright orange against the grey winter sky, and struck the concrete wall beside their firing slit. The napalm, thick as syrup and infinitely more deadly, didn't splash like liquid. It clung to the concrete, flowing like honey, seeking openings. Some of it poured through the firing slit. The temperature inside the bunker went from freezing to unbearable in less than a second. Hartmann felt the skin on his face tightening from radiant heat. The air itself seemed to be burning. Men were screaming, trying to get out the rear entrance, trampling each other in panic. Becker was shouting for order, but no one was listening. Military discipline, the foundation of German tactical success, had evaporated in the face of industrial horror. Hartmann made it out the rear exit, along with 4 others from his section. Behind them, the bunker was filled with black smoke and the smell of burning flesh. 2 men who had been too slow to escape were dying inside. Their screams had already stopped. The survivors ran through the forest, no longer soldiers but terrified animals fleeing a predator they couldn't fight. Behind them, the Zippos continued their methodical destruction of the defensive line. The entire German position, a fortified complex that had taken 3 weeks to construct and had stopped 2 American attacks, was neutralized in less than 45 minutes. Of the 240 men of Hartmann's company who had manned those positions, 89 were dead, most of them burned beyond recognition. 103 were captured, many of them wounded or suffering from smoke inhalation. Only 48 escaped, scattered through the forest in small groups with no organization and no will to fight. Hartmann's war ended 3 days later when he walked into an American checkpoint with his hands raised. He was suffering from frostbite, exposure, and something the army doctors didn't have a name for yet. What would later be called post-traumatic stress disorder. In his interrogation, conducted by American intelligence officers seeking information about German defensive positions, Hartmann refused to discuss tactics or troop dispositions. Instead, he talked obsessively about the flame tanks. "What kind of weapon shoots fire 200 meters?" he asked repeatedly. "How is that possible? What kind of people build such a thing?" The interrogating officer, a captain from the 2nd Armoured Division's intelligence section, tried to redirect him to military information. Hartmann became agitated. "You don't understand," he insisted. "We had concrete bunkers. We had the best position in the sector. We should have stopped you for days. But those tanks, those fire tanks, they just killed everyone. You can't fight against that. You can't hide from it. Fire that seeks you out, that flows through walls, that burns underwater." The captain noted in his report that the prisoner seemed more traumatized by the flame tanks than by anything he had experienced in 3 years on the Eastern Front, including the siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Kursk. "This is significant," the captain wrote, "because the psychological impact of the flame weapon appears to exceed its physical destructive power." Captured Germans described the M4A3R3 with fear approaching superstition. One prisoner stated that the flame tanks were not normal weapons, suggesting they were somehow supernatural or beyond the rules of warfare. This psychological effect should be exploited in future operations. The interrogation reports filtered up through American intelligence channels, reaching the desk of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe. Eisenhower, who had approved the limited deployment of flame tanks to Europe, somewhat reluctantly, now ordered that every armoured battalion be allocated at least 2 Zippos. The weapon that had been designed for Pacific Island fortifications had proven equally effective against European defensive works. German military intelligence analysing the American breakthrough in the Ardennes quickly identified the flame tanks as a critical new threat. A report circulated to all German units on the Western Front in February 1945 attempted to provide tactical guidance for countering the M4A3R3. The report was remarkable for its tone of barely concealed desperation. American flame tanks designated 4-3R3 represent a significant escalation in fortification assault capability. The weapon projects thickened petroleum fuel to ranges exceeding 150 meters, far beyond previous flame weapon capabilities. The fuel adheres to surfaces and continues burning for several minutes, creating sustained high temperatures capable of killing personnel through direct contact, oxygen depletion, or carbon monoxide poisoning. Defensive tactics. The flame tank must be destroyed before it comes within effective range. This requires engaging at ranges beyond 300 meters with anti-tank weapons. The flame projection system appears vulnerable to frontal damage. Concentrated machine gun fire into the bowgun port may damage the flame gun or fuel lines. If flame tanks approach defensive positions, immediate evacuation is recommended. Concrete bunkers and log fortifications do not provide protection against the flame weapon. The fuel flows through firing slits and ventilation openings. Personnel should retreat to open ground where the fuel cannot accumulate. That last recommendation, advising soldiers to abandon fortified positions when flame tanks approached, represented a complete reversal of German defensive doctrine. But field experience was proving that staying in a bunker when Zippos appeared meant certain death, while retreating offered at least a chance of survival. Not all German soldiers received or followed this guidance. The 6th SS Panzer Army, counterattacking in the Ardennes in late January, included numerous Waffen-SS units whose ideological commitment to fighting to the last man overrode tactical common sense. These units learned about flame tanks the hard way. On January 28, 1945, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandart Adolf Hitler had established a defensive line near the Belgian town of Malmedy. The position included a series of farmhouses converted into strongpoints, with interlocking fields of fire and carefully concealed anti-tank guns. The German plan was to hold the line long enough for armour reserves to move up for a counterattack. The American 2nd Armoured Division's attack included 4 Zippos from the 739th Tank Battalion. The SS defenders, many of them veterans of years of combat on both eastern and western fronts, watched the approaching flame tanks with contempt. The ideological indoctrination of SS units emphasized willpower and determination as superior to material advantage. If the Americans thought fire would make the SS retreat, they were about to learn otherwise. The first Zippo engaged a fortified farmhouse from approximately 120 yards. The 3-second burst poured burning napalm through the windows and doorway. Within seconds, the building was ablaze from inside. The SS soldiers inside, true to their training, attempted to continue fighting from the burning structure. None of them made it out. The second farmhouse received the same treatment, with the same results. But the third position, an SS platoon command post in a reinforced barn, decided to prove their superiority through action. As the Zippo approached, an SS Panzerschreck team emerged from cover and fired at point-blank range. The rocket-propelled shaped charge struck the Zippo's sponson, exactly where one of the napalm tanks was located. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. 145 gallons of napalm, already thickened and pressurized, erupted in a fireball that engulfed the tank and spread burning gel across a 50-yard radius. The Zippo's crew, trapped inside the inferno, never escaped. The vehicle burned for over an hour, its ammunition cooking off periodically as the fire consumed everything flammable. The SS soldiers, having achieved their first kill against a flame tank, celebrated briefly. Their celebration ended when the remaining 3 Zippos altered their tactics. Instead of approaching individually, they advanced in a staggered line covered by regular Shermans. When the SS anti-tank team attempted to engage again, a 75mm shell from a covering Sherman killed them before they could fire. The Zippos then systematically burned out every defensive position in the sector, working methodically from building to building. The SS unit's commander, recognizing that continued resistance meant total annihilation, ordered a withdrawal despite standing orders to hold position. His report to division headquarters attempted to justify the retreat. The American flame weapons create conditions that make sustained defense impossible. Personnel casualties from flame attack approach 100%. The psychological effect on survivors is severe. I assessed that remaining in position would result in the complete destruction of my battalion with no tactical gain. I ordered withdrawal to preserve combat-effective personnel. The division commander, SS Oberfuhrer Wilhelm Munker, was furious. He relieved the battalion commander and ordered the unit to retake its former position. The counterattack, launched at dusk without adequate reconnaissance, walked into an ambush. The Zippos, having learned that German forces were willing to sacrifice anti-tank teams to kill flame tanks, now operated with multiple supporting vehicles. When the SS troops attempted to close with Panzerschrecks, American machine gun fire cut them down at long range. The counterattack failed with heavy casualties. Munker, reviewing the after-action reports, quietly reinstated the battalion commander and revised the division's tactical guidance to acknowledge that flame tank attacks justified tactical withdrawal. Even the SS, despite their ideological commitment to fanatical resistance, recognized that fighting Zippos was suicide. By March 1945, the M4A3R3 had achieved a psychological impact out of proportion to its actual numbers. Fewer than 50 flame tanks were operating in the European theatre, but German soldiers believed they were far more numerous. Rumours spread through the Wehrmacht about entire battalions of flame tanks, about new variants that could shoot fire over a kilometre, about American plans to burn out every defensive position in Germany. These rumours were encouraged by American psychological operations. Leaflets dropped over German lines showed photographs of flame tanks in action, with text in German warning that continued resistance would result in every bunker, every foxhole, every building being burned. Radio broadcasts described flame tank operations in graphic detail, emphasizing the hopelessness of defending against such weapons. The psychological warfare was remarkably effective. German units that had fought stubbornly against conventional American armour often withdrew when flame tanks were reported in their sector, even if no Zippos were actually present. The mere rumour of flame tanks was enough to cause panic. American commanders learned to exploit this fear. Before major attacks, they would position flame tanks prominently, where German observers could see them, even if the Zippos weren't intended for use in that sector. The sight of flame tanks preparing for action often convinced German defenders to withdraw before the battle even started. But it was in urban combat that the M4A3R3 truly proved its value in Europe. Cities like Aachen, Cologne, and eventually Berlin presented defensive challenges similar to the cave complexes of the Pacific. Every building was a potential fortress, every basement a bunker, every cellar a hiding place. Conventional infantry assaults on urban positions were slow, costly, and brutal. The Zippo transformed urban warfare into a methodical process of building-by-building extermination. The technique developed during the Battle for Aachen in October 1944 became standard practice. Infantry would surround a defended building and call forward a flame tank. The Zippo would systematically flame every ground floor opening, pouring napalm into the structure. The building would either burn or the defenders would evacuate or they would die. There was no fourth option. Feldwebel Schneider, defending a row of apartments in Cologne in early March 1945, described the hopelessness of urban defence against flame tanks in his diary, recovered after his capture. March 6, 1945. The Americans are using fire tanks to clear the city building by building. We can hear them working down the street toward our position. The sound is distinctive, a roaring whoosh followed by screaming. Then silence. Then the roar again at the next building. We know what's coming. The captain says we must hold our position. He says German soldiers don't run from Americans, but he hasn't seen what those fire tanks do. March 7th, 1945. They reached our block today. We watched from the cellar windows as they burned the building across the street. The fire poured through the windows like water from a hose, except this water was orange and it stuck to everything. The men defending that building ran out, the back on fire, trying to reach the river. The Americans shot them down with machine guns, mercy killings probably. Better a bullet than burning. We drew straws tonight to see who would stay and who would try to escape before the fire tanks come. I drew a long straw. I'm going to try to reach the river after dark. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. Schneider's diary ended there. He was captured 3 days later, attempting to cross American lines with a white flag improvised from a torn shirt. His interrogation revealed that of the 35 men who had defended his section of Cologne, only 8 survived to surrender. The rest died in the systematic burning of the city. The American 3rd Armoured Division, which captured Cologne, employed 6 Zippos during the battle. These 6 tanks were directly responsible for neutralising over 200 fortified buildings with minimal American casualties. The division commander's report noted that flame tanks had reduced American infantry casualties by an estimated 60% compared to conventional urban assault methods. But the most significant employment of M4A3R3 flame tanks in Europe came during the final assault on German positions along the Rhine River in March 1945. The Germans had fortified the western bank of the Rhine with a defensive system they called the West Wall. Thousands of concrete bunkers, dragon's teeth anti-tank obstacles, and interlocking fortifications designed to make any crossing prohibitively costly. The American plan for Operation Lumberjack, the assault across the Rhine, called for overwhelming the West Wall defences through concentrated firepower. Among the assets allocated to the attack were 12 M4A3R3 flame tanks, the largest concentration of Zippos employed in a single operation in Europe. The attack began on March 7, 1945. The flame tanks advanced in pairs, each pair supported by 2 conventional Shermans and a platoon of infantry. The tactical method was brutally efficient. The infantry would identify fortified positions, the supporting Shermans would suppress the position with high explosive fire, then the Zippos would advance and flame each bunker systematically, working down the defensive line. German defenders faced an impossible choice. They could stay in their fortifications and burn, or they could evacuate and face machine gun fire in the open. Either way, they died. Some chose a third option, surrendering immediately when flame tanks appeared. Obergefreiter Paul Richter, defending a bunker complex near Remagen, described his decision to surrender in a post-war interview. "We heard the flame tanks coming. The sound was unmistakable by that point in the war. Everyone knew what it meant. Our lieutenant said we would fight to the last man, that German soldiers didn't surrender, but then we heard the screaming from the bunkers down the line. Men burning alive, crying for their mothers, begging for death. The lieutenant looked at us and asked if we wanted to die like that. Nobody did. We hung out a white flag before the flame tanks reached our position. The Americans took us prisoner. Some of the other men, the hardcore Nazis, called us cowards. But we're alive and they're not. I don't regret surrendering. You can't fight fire." The Rhine crossing succeeded far more rapidly than planners had anticipated. The West Wall, which German propaganda had claimed would hold the Allies for months, collapsed in less than a week. American forces poured across the river and drove deep into Germany. The flame tanks continued their methodical work, burning out defensive positions faster than the Germans could establish new ones. By April 1945, the M4A3R3 had destroyed thousands of fortified positions, killed tens of thousands of German soldiers, and psychologically broken the Wehrmacht's will to defend static positions. The weapon's effectiveness was measured not just in enemy casualties, but in the number of Germans who surrendered rather than faced the flames. But the cost of operating flame tanks was not measured only in enemy casualties. The American crews who operated Zippos paid their own psychological price. Staff Sergeant James T. Morrison, a flame tank commander with the 739th Tank Battalion, discussed the mental burden in a 1946 interview conducted by Army psychologists studying combat stress. Burning people alive is not clean killing. When you shoot someone with a tank gun, they just fall down or disappear. It's impersonal. But when you flame a bunker, you hear them screaming. You smell them burning. Even through the armour, even over the engine noise, you hear it. And you keep firing because that's your job. After a while, you stop thinking of them as people. They're just targets. You have to think that way or you'll go insane. But at night, when you're trying to sleep, you remember. You remember every time you pulled that trigger, every bunker you burned, every time someone screamed. I killed more men in 3 months with a flame tank than some infantry soldiers killed in 3 years. The numbers are big. But each one of those numbers was a person who burned to death because I pressed a button. Morrison's experience was not unique. Flame tank crews showed significantly higher rates of combat stress reactions than regular tank crews, despite being exposed to less direct enemy fire. The psychological burden of being the direct agent of horrific death, rather than the relatively impersonal killing done by conventional weapons, took a measurable toll. The Army's solution was to rotate flame tank crews more frequently than other tankers and to provide them with more rest time between operations. Some crews refused to continue operating flame tanks and requested transfers to conventional Army units. These requests were usually granted without prejudice. The Army recognised that not every soldier could handle the psychological weight of operating weapons designed specifically to inflict maximum suffering, even if that suffering was militarily justified. The final chapter of the M4A3R3's combat history in Europe was written during the Battle of Berlin in April and May 1945. Soviet forces attacking from the east employed their own flame tanks, including the OT-34 and specialised assault guns. But it was American flame tanks, operating on the periphery of the city as part of the Western Allied advance, that left the most detailed records of urban flame warfare. The 3rd Armoured Division, pushing toward the Elbe River, encountered fanatical resistance from Volkssturm units, Hitler Youth, and die-hard SS formations ordered to defend every street. These defenders, many of them teenagers or elderly men with minimal training, had been told that American flame tanks would burn them regardless of whether they surrendered. Nazi propaganda had transformed the Zippo from a weapon into a symbol of American brutality, claiming that the Americans intentionally burned prisoners and civilians. This propaganda backfired catastrophically. Instead of stiffening resistance, it convinced many defenders that surrender was pointless, leading to needless bloodshed on both sides. But it also meant that when flame tanks did appear, the psychological impact was even more devastating than usual. Defenders who had been told to expect no mercy often broke completely when faced with the reality of the weapon. Lieutenant Robert Henderson, commanding a Zippo named Hot Tamale, encountered a particularly tragic situation in a small town outside Leipzig on April 17, 1945. His after-action report captured the horror of total war in its final days. "We were ordered to clear a factory complex being used as a defensive position. Intelligence reported approximately 80 defenders, a mixture of Volkssturm and Hitler Youth. Standard procedure, we approached with infantry support and called for surrender. No response. We could see movement in the windows, weapons being positioned. I gave the order to flame the ground floor. 3-second burst through the main entrance. Immediate secondary fires as the napalm ignited stored materials inside. Then we heard the screaming. But this wasn't the usual sound of men dying. This was different. Higher pitched. We realized there were children in there. The infantry rushed the building trying to get the kids out. They pulled out maybe a dozen, all burned, most of them dying. Turned out the Hitler Youth were boys aged 12 to 14. They'd been given rifles and told to defend the factory or be shot as traitors. Their commander was a 16-year-old SS fanatic who had shot 2 boys who tried to surrender before we attacked. By the book, we did everything right. We called for surrender, we gave them time to respond. They were armed and defending a military objective. But I killed a dozen children that day. The fact that it was legal, that it was justified, that it was necessary, doesn't make it any easier to live with." Henderson's report and dozens like it documented the descent into barbarism that characterized the final weeks of the European War. The M4A3R3, designed as a tool for reducing fortified positions with minimal friendly casualties, had become an instrument of total destruction, employed against an enemy that could no longer effectively resist but refused to surrender. The psychological impact on German civilians was as significant as the military effect on soldiers. Refugees fleeing westward toward American lines in the final weeks of the war reported that fear of flame tanks was second, only to fear of Soviet reprisals in motivating their flight. Entire towns surrendered immediately when they learned that American forces included Zippos, hoping to avoid the systematic burning that had consumed other communities. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The M4A3R3 flame tanks, which had been in combat in Europe for less than 5 months, had fundamentally altered German defensive calculations and contributed significantly to the rapid collapse of organised resistance in the war's final weeks. The final tally of M4A3R3 operations in Europe was sobering. The approximately 50 flame tanks deployed to the theatre had directly destroyed over 2,000 fortified positions, killed an estimated 15,000 enemy soldiers, and caused an unknown number of additional casualties through smoke inhalation, carbon monoxide poisoning, and burns sustained during evacuation of flamed positions. More significantly, the psychological impact had convinced tens of thousands of German soldiers to surrender rather than face the flames. The cost to American forces was comparatively minimal. 8 Zippos were destroyed in combat, 7 by anti-tank weapons and 1 by a mine. Of these, only 3 resulted in crew casualties, as most flame tank crews were able to evacuate before their vehicles' fuel tanks detonated. This loss rate was actually lower than that of conventional Sherman tanks, possibly because flame tanks were typically employed with more caution and better support than regular armour. But the post-war assessment of the M4A3R3 was complicated by growing discomfort with flame weapons generally. The horrors revealed as Allied forces liberated concentration camps and documented Nazi atrocities created a moral atmosphere in which weapons designed specifically to burn people alive seemed increasingly problematic, even when employed against legitimate military targets. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducting post-war analysis of weapons effectiveness, noted that while flame tanks were tactically successful, their use raised difficult ethical questions. The report, classified until 1973, included surprisingly frank discussion of the weapon's nature. The M4A3R3 flame tank represents the pinnacle of flame weapon development. Its range, fuel capacity, and reliability exceed all previous flame weapons by substantial margins. Its tactical effectiveness in reducing fortified positions is unquestioned. Infantry. Casualties were significantly reduced in operations where flame tanks were employed. However, the weapon's mechanism of killing, burning, and suffocation creates death that is both prolonged and agonizing. While international law does not prohibit flame weapons against military targets, the nature of death inflicted raises moral questions that transcend legal frameworks. Enemy soldiers exposed to flame attack often died in ways that combat veterans describe as uniquely horrible. Captured enemy personnel consistently described flame tank attacks as more terrifying than any other weapon, including artillery bombardment and aerial bombing. Several captured officers stated they had ordered their men to shoot wounded personnel rather than allow them to burn to death. The psychological impact on friendly forces operating flame tanks was also notable, with crew members showing elevated rates of combat stress reactions. Future employment of flame weapons should consider not only tactical effectiveness, but also the moral and psychological cost to both enemy and friendly personnel. This ambivalence about flame weapons would shape post-war American military policy. While the M4A3R3 remained in service and would see combat again in Korea, the enthusiasm for flame weapons that had characterized the Pacific War never returned. The Korean War, beginning in June 1950, would provide the final combat test of the M4A3R3 in American service. The mountainous terrain of Korea, with its caves, tunnels, and fortified positions, seemed ideal for flame tank employment, and initially, the Zippo proved as effective in Korea as it had been in the Pacific and Europe. The 1st Marine Division, landing at Incheon in September 1950, included 8 M4A3R3 flame tanks. These were essentially identical to the models used in World War II, with minor modifications to fire control systems and improved armour protection. The Marine Corps had retained its institutional knowledge of flame tank operations and doctrine from the Pacific War. North Korean and Chinese forces, defending positions in Korea's countless hills and ridges, discovered what German and Japanese soldiers had learned before them: that fortified positions offering protection against conventional weapons were death traps when flame tanks appeared. The tactics were unchanged from 1945. Approach under covering fire, flame the position, move to the next target. But something had changed in the 5 years since World War II ended. The American public, watching newsreels of flame tank operations in Korea, reacted with discomfort rather than the grim satisfaction that had greeted similar footage from the Pacific. The emerging television media brought images of burning into American living rooms, and the impact was disturbing even when the targets were clearly enemy soldiers. Press coverage began questioning whether flame weapons were necessary or appropriate. Newspaper editorials asked if burning people alive was consistent with American values, even in wartime. Some religious leaders condemned flame weapons as inherently immoral, regardless of their tactical utility. The military's response was defensive. Flame tanks, commanders argued, actually saved lives by reducing the need for costly infantry assaults on fortified positions. The alternative to flaming a bunker was sending soldiers to assault it directly, which meant higher friendly casualties. Was it more moral to sacrifice American soldiers than to burn enemy soldiers who refused to surrender? The debate became moot when the military itself began moving away from flame tanks for practical rather than moral reasons. The M4A3R3, based on the World War II-era Sherman, was increasingly obsolescent. Newer tanks like the M26 Pershing and M46 Patton offered better armour and firepower. Converting these newer platforms to flame tanks was expensive and complicated. More significantly, the tactical environment was changing. The fortified positions that made flame tanks so valuable in World War II were less common in Korea's mobile warfare. When the war settled into static trench warfare reminiscent of World War I, flame tanks proved less useful against dispersed defensive positions than against concentrated bunker complexes. By 1951, the M4A3R3 was being phased out of frontline service, replaced by more modern armoured vehicles. Some Zippos were converted back to conventional gun tanks. Others were relegated to training duties or scrapped. A few were preserved in museums, silent testimony to American industrial power and the brutal pragmatism of total war. The final combat employment of the M4A3R3 in American service came during the Siege of Outpost Harry in June 1953, one of the last major engagements of the Korean War. Chinese forces had dug an elaborate tunnel system around the outpost, creating fortified positions that resisted artillery and airstrikes. 2 flame tanks, among the last Zippos in theatre, were called forward to clear the tunnels. The operation was successful in military terms. The flame tanks systematically burned out the tunnel entrances, killing an unknown number of Chinese soldiers and forcing the survivors to retreat. But the after-action photographs, showing charred bodies and burnt equipment, generated controversy when they appeared in American newspapers. Public opinion had shifted decisively against flame weapons. The armistice that ended the Korean War in July 1953 also ended the combat career of the M4A3R3. The remaining Zippos were withdrawn from service, and the United States Army made a quiet decision not to develop replacement flame tanks for its new generation of armoured vehicles. The Marine Corps retained some flame capability through portable flamethrowers and specialised vehicles, but the era of the dedicated flame tank was effectively over. In 1963, the last M4A3R3 was removed from the Marine Corps inventory. A few examples were preserved in museums. The rest was scrapped, their armour plates cut up and melted down, their flame projectors destroyed, their napalm tanks emptied and cleaned. The most effective fortification killer ever developed disappeared from American arsenals without fanfare or public discussion. But the legacy of the Zippo extended far beyond its years of service. The tactical lessons learned from flame tank operations influenced the development of thermobaric weapons, fuel-air explosives, and other modern weapons designed to attack fortified positions. The psychological principles that creating weapons of exceptional horror could break enemy morale and hasten surrender continued to shape military thinking. More controversially, the M4A3R3's career raised questions about weapons development that remain unresolved. Should militaries develop weapons that kill in particularly horrible ways if those weapons are tactically effective? Where is the line between legitimate military necessity and excessive cruelty? Who decides whether the reduction in friendly casualties justifies the infliction of extraordinary suffering on the enemy? These questions became particularly relevant during the Vietnam War, when the United States employed napalm extensively against both military and civilian targets. The horrific injuries caused by napalm burns, broadcast on television news, generated massive public opposition and contributed to the anti-war movement. The iconic photograph of a Vietnamese girl running from a napalm strike, her clothes burned away, became a symbol of the war's horror. The United States gradually restricted its use of napalm and similar weapons, responding to both international pressure and domestic opposition. In 1980, the United Nations Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons included Protocol 3, specifically addressing incendiary weapons. The protocol prohibited using incendiary weapons against military targets located within concentrations of civilians and banned air-delivered incendiary weapons against military targets within civilian areas. The United States signed the convention, but with significant reservations, maintaining that flame weapons remained legitimate tools of warfare when employed against purely military targets in accordance with the laws of war. This position reflected the military's continued belief, based on experiences in World War II and Korea, that flame weapons served legitimate tactical purposes in specific situations. Today, modern militaries retain limited flame weapon capability through portable flamethrowers, thermobaric weapons, and white phosphorus munitions. But the dedicated flame tank, the weapon that terrified German soldiers in the Ardennes and Japanese defenders on Pacific Islands, has disappeared from modern arsenals. The M4A3R3 Zippo remains the ultimate expression of flame weapon development, never exceeded and never replaced. The few surviving Zippos in museums stand as monuments to American industrial power and tactical innovation. They also serve as reminders of war's fundamental nature, that victory often requires not just defeating the enemy, but breaking their will to resist, and that the most effective way to break that will is sometimes through weapons that exploit primal human fears. Klaus Hartmann, the German soldier who fled his bunker in the Ardennes rather than face the flame tanks, survived the war and eventually emigrated to the United States in 1952. In a 1983 interview conducted by a military historian researching flame weapon employment, Hartmann, then 66 years old and a naturalized American citizen, reflected on his experience. "I fought for 3 years on the Eastern Front. I saw things in Russia that still give me nightmares. Stalingrad, Kursk, the retreat through Poland. I thought I had seen every horror war could produce. But nothing in my experience compared to those flame tanks in Belgium. The Russians were brutal. They fought like animals. We fought like animals. It was kill or be killed, and both sides understood that. But there was something about those American tanks, something that went beyond normal combat. They weren't just trying to kill us. They were trying to make us so terrified that we couldn't fight back, and it worked. I was a good soldier. I had medals. I had survived when most of my comrades were dead. But when I saw what those flame tanks did, I couldn't stay. I couldn't die like that. Nobody could. After the war, I hated Americans for years. I blamed you for using weapons like that, for building machines designed to burn people alive. But as I got older, as I learned more about the war from the other side, I understood. You were trying to end the war quickly. You were trying to save your own soldiers. The flame tanks did that. They were horrible, but they worked. If I had been American, if I had been the commander deciding how to break through German defences with minimum casualties to my own men, would I have used flame tanks? Yes, of course I would have. Any commander would. That's what makes them so terrible. They're not just effective, they're necessary. In the situation you faced, given the defensive positions we had built, flame tanks were the logical solution. I forgave America for the flame tanks years ago. What I've never been able to forgive is the men on both sides who put us in positions where such weapons became necessary. The leaders who started the war, who refused to end it, who demanded that we fight to the death in bunkers we couldn't hold. They're the ones responsible for the burning, not the soldiers who pressed the triggers. But I'll tell you this, if I close my eyes, I can still see that orange flame arcing through the air. I can still hear the screaming from the bunker next to mine. I'm an old man now, I've lived in peace for nearly 40 years, but that sight, that sound, it never leaves you. Never. Hartman died in 1987. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his wartime service or his encounter with flame tanks. He was remembered as a machinist, a good neighbour, and a devoted grandfather. The horror he had witnessed in Belgium remained private, shared only with historians and occasionally with other veterans who understood. The story of the M4A3R3 Zippo is ultimately a story about the nature of war and the weapons humanity creates to wage it. In the desperate final years of World War II, American industry produced a weapon that combined mechanical sophistication with primitive terror, a machine that killed by fire, mankind's oldest weapon wrapped in modern steel and powered by industrial chemistry. The Germans who mocked the early flame tanks, who laughed at American engineering and questioned American understanding of warfare, learned that industrial power guided by tactical pragmatism could create weapons beyond their imagination. The flying milk bottles of the P-47 and the flame tanks of the armoured divisions represented the same philosophy. Overwhelming material superiority applied without mercy, until the enemy's will to resist was completely broken. The M4A3R3 succeeded brilliantly in its intended role. It reduced fortified positions faster and more effectively than any previous weapon. It saved thousands of American lives by eliminating the need for costly infantry assaults. It broke enemy morale and hastened the end of both the Pacific and European wars. By every objective military measure, it was one of the most successful weapons developed during World War II. But success in war is measured in more than just tactical effectiveness. The Zippo's legacy includes not only the positions it destroyed and the lives it saved, but also the soldiers it burned, the crews it traumatized, and the questions it raised about the limits of acceptable violence in warfare. Modern military professionals studying the M4A3R3 focus on its tactical employment, its technical specifications, and its operational effectiveness. But they also confront the uncomfortable reality that the weapon succeeded precisely because it killed in a way that exceeded normal combat horror, that exploited fundamental human fear of burning, and that created death so terrible that soldiers preferred surrender or suicide to facing it. The engineers who designed the Zippo created a mechanical marvel, a system that could project 290 gallons of burning gel with precision and reliability under combat conditions. The soldiers who operated it demonstrated courage and discipline, pressing triggers that killed in horrible ways because that was their duty. The commanders who employed it made rational tactical decisions, accepting moral complexity in exchange for military effectiveness and reduced friendly casualties. But in the end, the story of the M4A3R3 is the story of men burning alive in bunkers, while other men operated the machines that killed them, both groups following orders in a war that had long since transcended reason or restraint. The Germans who mocked American flame tanks, in January 1945 weren't wrong to laugh. They were simply underestimating American industry's capacity to create weapons that made laughter impossible. In the museums where surviving Zippos are displayed, visitors can examine the flame gun mechanism, study the fuel tank configuration, and read technical specifications. But the plaques don't mention the smell of burning flesh, the sound of men screaming as napalm consumed them, or the psychological scars carried by both the burned and the burners. Those details exist only in fading combat reports, classified documents, and the increasingly rare testimonies of veterans who remember. The M4A3R3 Zippo proved that American industry could build anything, no matter how terrible, if military necessity demanded it. It demonstrated that tactical effectiveness could overcome moral discomfort, that weapons designed to exploit primal fears could be deployed by democratic nations fighting for just causes, and that the line between necessary violence and excessive cruelty becomes invisible in the fog of total war. The Germans laughed at American flame tanks in January 1945, believing them to be clumsy copies of ineffective weapons they had already encountered. By May 1945, those who survived weren't laughing. They were surrendering as fast as they could, desperate to avoid the flame that had consumed their comrades, haunted by the sound that Klaus Hartmann described as worse than anything he had experienced in 3 years of brutal warfare. The thunder of the P-47's 8 machine guns announced American air superiority. The flame of the M4A3R3 Zippo announced something darker, that American industry could create weapons beyond imagination, deploy them without hesitation, and operate them until the enemy's capacity to resist was completely destroyed. The flying milk bottles and the Zippos were opposite sides of the same coin, technological superiority wrapped in armour and delivered with overwhelming force. In the end, the German soldiers who faced these weapons learned what the Japanese had discovered in the Pacific: that mocking American engineering was a fatal mistake, that the nation which could produce such weapons in such numbers would inevitably win the war, and that survival meant surrender, because continuing to fight against such overwhelming material and psychological superiority was simply another form of suicide. The M4A3R3 Zippo entered service as a specialized tool for a specific problem and became a symbol of Total War's descent into industrial horror. Its mechanical sophistication and tactical effectiveness were matched by its capacity to terrorize and traumatize. It saved American lives at the cost of inflicting deaths so terrible that hardened veterans spoke of them with dread decades later. And in doing so, it raised questions about warfare's moral boundaries that remain unanswered to this day. The flame tanks are gone now, scrapped or preserved, silent behind museum glass. But their legacy persists in the continuing debate about weapons design, in the tension between military necessity and moral restraint, and in the recognition that victory in modern war requires not just defeating the enemy, but breaking them so completely that continued resistance becomes unthinkable. The Zippo achieved that goal through fire. Whether the achievement justified the horror remains a question each generation must answer for itself.